targeted towards Arabs and Muslims. So at the time, George Bush was sort of painting himself as this compassionate conservative and really trying to court the Muslim vote and deceiving them very, very well. So he basically, the way he was able to win, ironically, the Arab and Muslim vote was during the second presidential debate, which was televised. He stood up and he said, if I'm elected president, I'm going to end the use of secret evidence against Arabs. So that was enough, really, to win their votes. And at the same time, the Gore campaign was very unresponsive to any sort of overtures by the Arab and Muslim communities. And they were just very arrogant. Unfortunately, this is a trend with the Democratic Party where they take votes for granted, especially votes of minority groups, and really don't make an effort to win them over. So the Muslim community ended up endorsing Bush, not really also realizing who his sort of team, his cabinet was that he was bringing in, not realizing the power of this neoconservative movement, the backing of the Christian right. I mean, a lot of these issues weren't very known then, and as they say, hindsight is 20/20. So sure enough, they elected him, and particularly in Florida, where we were living, which of course decided the election. And then, as my father liked to say, with Bush we went from secret evidence to no evidence. So, of course, that took us back decades. So after 9/11, a bigot and a caricature by the name of Bill O'Reilly, who I'm sure you've heard of, had my father on his show, and he just went completely berserk on the air. He was actually fed information by Michael Fechter, this newspaper reporter I told you about, and he fed him basically lies about my father that, like I said, just the same old tired claims. And Bill O'Reilly on the air said, if I were the CIA, I would follow you everywhere you went, Dr. Al-Arian, and just menacing him and threatening him and bullying him like he's so known for. And, we know what happened with the Rwandan genocide in 1994. You had people on the radio propagating hate, and their role was huge. And to me, people like Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity and these types of characters who propagate hate and who threaten lives and livelihoods are no different than the people who took part in the Rwandan genocide. I just find their role completely reprehensible, and they're never held accountable for the lives they've destroyed. Sorry, I had to get that out there. And I should say that O'Reilly's producers, not only did he say these horrible things on the air with no regard for the truth, but his producers actually lied to my father repeatedly. Just took part in really weird shenanigans that are contrary to every journalistic ethic. In any case, moving on, after that, his crazy, irrational, racist viewers started sending in death threats to my father, and to our home, to his personal email, to his work email, and even to his office at the university where he was teaching. And the university, rather than protect my father, one of their employees, an award-winning professor who was well-respected and well-regarded, actually punished my father by suspending him. And a few months later, firing him in his absence with no regard for due process. He was a tenured professor, no regard for tenure, for the whole process. And the way they did it was actually so shameful. It was during winter break, so no students or professors were even there when they fired him. And what we later discovered was that the board of directors was really pushing hard on this. And what happened was when Jeb Bush, our governor at the time, was elected, he sort of did away with the Board of Regents system for universities, which is, there were academics that would serve on boards of universities. Isn't that a radical idea to have people who actually know their field serving on the board? But instead, he brought in his rich Republican donors to serve on the board of the university. Of course, they had no regard for academia, for academic freedom, freedom of speech. All of those were quaint ideas. And they actually let their racism and their fear and Islamophobia guide their actions. So, the chairman of the board, Dick Beard, was going around in the media calling my father a cancer on the university, and, using all these, really inflammatory terms to describe my father, and he was the one pushing hard for it. And they fired him, and they came under fire by a lot of academic freedom groups, professors' unions, all over the country were supporting my father. Because it was clear that the only reason they fired him was because of his beliefs, and because he dared exercise his right to free speech, and because of who he was, a Palestinian. So at the time, the American Association of University Professors threatened to censure the university for what they'd done to my father, and this was huge. The university censured, a lot of people, they don't get the grants they want, they can't draw the types of star professors that they want to bring to their campuses, so it really had major ramifications. The Washington Post and the New York Times issued editorials in support of my father, so he really became this sort of cause célèbre in terms of academic free speech post 9/11. So the university panicked, and essentially what we believed happened, and this was sort of hinted at in a Time magazine article that came out in late 2005, is that there was a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering to bring about an indictment against my father. The university wanted to get itself out of this huge mess that it created for itself, and it even resorted to really strange tactics to stall until an indictment came. So they sued my father in court, and I mean, who sues a professor after firing him? And of course, the lawsuit was laughed out of court, but it was just a way to stall until the indictment happened. We believe that the governor himself was connected to the indictment, that he was pushing for it in Washington, D.C. And we believe that the decision to indict my father went all the way to the top of the Bush administration, I mean, at all levels. And in fact, what Time magazine reported was that it was personally ordered by John Ashcroft. I mean, it's extremely unusual for the Attorney General himself to order an indictment of someone, at the objection of prosecutors in Florida who said, we don't have anything on this guy, we're not ready to build a case against him. So what they essentially did was they arrested my father in February 2003, and they said, okay, we're going to indict him now and build a case later. And that was sort of the attitude. So they held him under the most atrocious conditions imaginable. It was very much like Guantanamo Bay, for 2.5 years, solitary confinement. Even though all of the convicted felons in prison could hug their families and see them face to face, we had to visit my father behind glass. They would insist on stripping him before and after each visit, even though we would see him behind glass. So it was all these ways to really humiliate him and to psychologically break him down before trial. Even his attorneys were harassed. So if his lawyer wanted to go in and carry legal documents with her to meet with my father, they would just come up with all these arbitrary rules, like you can only bring in one-inch stack of paper. Well, the indictment itself was 3 inches, large. So how could they, they were basically trying to restrict even his ability to prepare a defense for trial. So in any case, we had to really go through this for 2.5 years where we saw him suffer under these conditions. He wasn't even given a clock to know when the prayer was. Of course, he couldn't see the sun for months at a time. And at the same time, we were preparing for trial. Remember, this is Florida. This is a place where they polled people, and the vast majority of people had heard about my father. And what they were subjected to were these articles I told you about by this reporter who had a vendetta against my father, who's agenda-driven, whose views on Israel basically colored everything he wrote, and who had no journalistic ethics or morals or regard for the truth. And so they were subjected to a decade, basically, of these types of articles. So we had basically the deck was stacked against us from the very beginning. We were very worried about the jury pool. And the judge in the case was denying one motion after another. He was also extremely